Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. As the end of the year approaches, I bring you a video all about the endings to Agatha Christie novels with a top 10 ranking of Christie's best endings. And by endings, I mean how the novel ends, not the actual solution to the mystery. I'm not talking about how Christie wraps up the mystery, but how she wraps up the narrative, which on occasion does include solving the mystery, but usually does not. Now, obviously, spoilers are ahead. It's unavoidable in this video, but you can use the chapter titles to skip through any novel you don't want to be spoiled on. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel, and join in the Discord server if you haven't already, link in the description below. Let's start out with some honorable mentions in publication order, starting with the ABC murders, which ends with Alexander Bonaparte Cust getting some recognition and fame, which is a nice moment for him. We have Dumb Witness, which ends with Poirot receiving Bob from Miss Lawson and just absolutely hating the dog, which is funny, but not enough for the top 10. Death on the Nile was so close to making the list. It bookends the beginning of that novel with all the men talking about Lynette Ridgway, now Doyle, only, now she's dead and everyone has forgotten about her and moved on with their lives. Hercule Poirot's Christmas, which ends with the Lees moving on with their lives for the first time, but also with Poirot complaining about the lack of central heating, which I always found funny. And then There Were None is a novel to mention here. To be honest, not really that close to making the list, but I do think it's one of the more memorable endings with the message in the bottle. The Moving Finger was another close one to making the list. We get updates on everyone in Limstock and who's hooking up with who. This probably would have made the list, but I just really didn't care about Megan and Jerry's relationship. It's a bit weird, to be honest. Crooked House has a very dramatic ending, but it's also one that, to me, just does not stand out compared to those in the top 10. It did not immediately come to my mind as an all-time great ending. 450 from Paddington has the ever popular ambiguous ending, who over Lucy Islesbarrow and who she's going to select as a suitor. Endless Night is another very dramatic ending. It is probably the best part of that novel, but like Crooked House, to me, it was not one that immediately stood out. And finally, we have Curtain, which calls back the ending to The Mysterious Affair at Styles, about Poirot and Hastings hunting together again, only this time they will hunt no more. And I have to mention a dishonorable mention here with Taken at the Flood, which is my pick for the absolute worst ending to a Christie novel. If you know, you know. Again, nothing else really came to mind as what's the worst Christie ending ever. It's very clearly Taken at the Flood. Onto the proper list at number 10. And these first two here are just because I find them funny and enjoyable rather than them being the most profound ending. But at number 10, I have the ending to A Murder is Announced. And I think this could have been swapped out for Death on the Nile or Endless Night or Crooked House or something like that. But the ending to A Murder is Announced is one I instantly thought of, and that is this very brief passage involving Edmund Swettenham and Philippa Hames as they go to the clerk's office to sign up for their newspaper deliveries, and the clerk does not understand why they don't want the Chipping Claycorn Gazette, because everybody wants the Chipping Claycorn Gazette, and the clerk is just not getting that they repeatedly tell him they don't want the Gazette, only for them to leave the office thinking they're not getting the Gazette, and the clerk be like, oh yeah, they want the Chipping Claycorn Gazette, and just they're totally traumatized by the events of the novel, so they don't want the newspaper, which set it all off. The clerk just not getting that. And I just think this ending is so memorable because of its humor, but it's also symbolic of the frustrations of the time where everything is changing in this post-war era. The young people don't want the thing that older people want and that everybody wants, and they're not going to get what they want. There is a very small amount of symbolism here. So I put A Murder is Announced at number 10. At number 9, probably the funniest ending in my opinion, and it's all packed into one line, and this ending comes from Three Act Tragedy, where Poirot has just finished his summation gathering and mentions how the killer chose his victims at random, or at least the first victim at random, and how it could have been anyone, and it just happened to be Reverend Babington. And Mr. Satterthwaite is horrified because he realizes it could have been him who grabbed that poison cocktail off the tray. And Poirot interrupts him, says there's even a more horrific possibility. that it could have been Poirot. And I just love how conceited Poirot is in this moment where he values his life as so much more important than everyone else's. But he's completely serious in this moment. Like, this is not a joke. This is a serious moment for Poirot. And I think this is just the absolute funniest ending to a Christie novel. And it comes in at number 9. At number 8 is another humorous one that's not as funny as number 9, but there are more elements to this one, and that comes from Cards on the Table, which I suspect some of you might be like scrambling to remember what the ending of this novel is, because it's not one of the more famous ones, but it's one that's always stuck out to me. It ends right after Poirot explains how he tricked the murderer by hiring that actor to be the window washer, and Rhoda Dawes is like all aghast at how clever and deceitful Poirot is. And it ends with this line from Major Despard about how someone should stab Poirot to death and watch his ghost come back to life and solve his own murder. I just really love this line, not only because it's funny, because I also think this would have made like a very stellar final Poirot novel. And slight spoiler, for Curtain here, we do sort of get this in Curtain, like a very tiny bit, not in the way Major Despard describes it, but we do sort of have Poirot solving his murder from beyond the grave. Not exactly, but I mean, if you've read Curtain, you understand what I'm talking about. But there are like little tiny elements of this in Curtain, so I do have Cards on the Table at number 8. At number 7, starting here, we have two of the more notable endings, and at number 7, we have Murder on the Orient Express, which ends with one of the most iconic scenes in detective fiction where Poirot steps away from the case after Monsieur Bouc and Dr. Constantine declare the murderer to be the small man with the womanish voice. Poirot washing his hands of the case, refusing to admit that he is letting the culprits go free and that it is out of his control, but also giving his silent nod of approval to that decision. And I've always liked the novel version of this where Poirot doesn't really hesitate here, as is his nature. It's very fitting for Poirot to have like made up his mind and stick with it, even with a very difficult and morally gray decision here. He's let murderers go out before. He's let them off themselves. He's induced their own murders, their own deaths at one time. So, I mean, here it would make sense for Poirot to just not hesitate. He is firm in his convictions. Many of the adaptations of this novel have Poirot like racking his brain over what to do and flip-flopping, and it's not really in Poirot's character to do that. It does make for good drama, but it's just not Poirot. So I've always liked the finale to this book. So Murder on the Orient Express comes in at number 7. At number 6, we have another very notable ending, and that is from The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, where Dr. Shepard confesses his culpability in blackmailing Mrs. Ferrars and murdering Roger Ackroyd, and he details how he wanted to be the person who stumped and defeated Poirot, and now he has to take his own life to spare his sister because he lost to Poirot. Poirot figured him out, and this is just an excellent downfall for such an iconic Christie killer, one of the most arrogant of the bunch. And I do think perhaps this ending does lack a bit of like an iconic, like specific moment, but the twist of, Shepard explaining everything and his own thoughts and his disgust that he lost to Poirot is just too good to pass up. Also, the fact that he's our narrator, a bit shocking, although the revelation that he is the murderer does come a little bit earlier. It's not like the very end of the novel, so it's not really factoring in here. But, I mean, to me, this is just one of the most iconic, most well-known, most famous endings to any detective novel, so I had to put The Murder of Roger Ackroyd here at number 6. At number 5, and to me, this is where the truly elite endings begin, starting with, and perhaps here we have a less iconic one, but this one comes from Dead Man's Folly. And again, this one it's a bit ambiguous as to how it ends. And normally, ambiguity is a bad thing in a mystery novel because the reader wants and expects clear answers. But to me, that only applies to the solution of the mystery. The resolution of the novel can be ambiguous, and I love partaking in debates and discussing these ambiguities. I have that video series on like conspiracy theories and unanswered questions. And Dead Man's Folly is one of these ambiguous solutions regarding Mrs. Folliot. And I think the ending of this novel is beautifully written when Poirot confronts Mrs. Folliot over her role in the murders. Remember, she isn't the killer per se, but she allowed the murders to happen to spare spare her son, but mostly to spare Nass House and make sure it remains in family hands. And Poirot confronts her, and Mrs. Foley says she needs to be alone to face the tragedy by herself, and she does so. And Poirot hears the sounds of the construction workers digging up the Folly as she makes this choice here. And what is Mrs. Folliot going to do? It's an open-ended question and just beautifully written. You feel her emotions as she comes to the realization that it's over. She's been found out. She's going to lose Nass House. She's going to lose her son. She might lose her own life. The end is near. And you also feel Poirot, his accepting her choice here, seemingly approving of it. Perhaps, I will give my thoughts on what I think happens here in a future theory unanswered question video. But for now, I'll leave it ambiguous what I think. But this truly fantastic ending, the strongest part of the novel, and Dead Man's Folly, comes in at number 5. At number 4, a novel that ends far less ambiguously, and that is from Lord Edgware Dies, which ends with a letter from our killer, Jane Wilkinson, one of the most iconic Christie killers. She writes to Hastings this short letter about her and all that she did, and it comes across as so egotistical and just extremely fitting for her character. But my favorite is the very end. She's about to be hanged, courtesy of Poirot and Hastings, mostly Poirot, and Jane Wilkinson more or less loves this fate for herself. I mean, she's relishing in the glory here. She's going to be infamous, and she wonders if she will be put in Madame Tussauds wax museum, to which the reader will be left wondering in what section of the museum will she be, the famous actors section or the famous killers. She also wishes to have this grand execution, the greatest hanging Britain has ever seen, with lots of people in attendance. And even in her demise, she's chasing fame and notoriety. She is not at all bitter about being discovered. She loves it. Just a wonderful assessment to her character that even in death, she takes in stride and has an opportunity for fame. This novel could not end in any better way, and Lord Edgware Dies comes in at number 4. At number 3, we are finally returning to a Miss Marple novel here with Nemesis. And this is such a great conclusion to the Marpleverse. I know there's Sleeping Murder, but to me, Nemesis is the final Miss Marple, with Sleeping Murder having been written much earlier. Nemesis feels like the final Marple, and it ends really in a spectacular way, with Miss Marple, having solved the murder of Verity Hunt and captured her killer, claims the reward Mr. Raphael has left for her in his will. And this seems like just another ending, but for Miss Marple, this is everything. She will have a large sum of money for the first time in her life, and she lists all of the luxuries she's going to spend that money on, and they're all quaint and Marpelian things, like eating a bunch of marron glacé, and she's not going to buy, a real red sports car or something. And for her, this is the achievement of her life, and not only that, this is really the first time Miss Marple receives public recognition for her skills. She's never had the credit before. In all of our other novels and stories, she lets Craddock or Slack or whoever it is take the credit because they're the police, and also because Miss Marple operates in the background. She cannot receive the credit and continue to be underestimated. People will not confide in her if they know what she's really up to. But now that she has received the honor, she's basically retired from crime solving. I've speculated in the past in a conspiracy video that Miss Marple dies off page at the end of this novel, having achieved and completed her greatest case and overindulged in marron glacé. There is nothing left for her to do. That is the end, and a fitting end for her, but there are two better endings in my opinion, so Nemesis comes in at number 3. At number 2, and this was tough, I always knew these two would be the top 2, and the order kept flip-flopping because they're so close, and I did make a last-minute change before I locked in my order. So at number 2, I have what I suspect many people might think would be number 1, but it's number 2, and that is A Pocket Full of Rye. And I've seen many of you comment that this is the greatest ending to a Christie novel, and for much of my time ordering these, this was number 1, and to be honest, I still see the case for it. 1 and 2, for me, are basically tied, and this novel ends with Miss Marple, having solved the murders at Yew Tree Lodge, but unable to prove it, return home to St. Mary Mead, devastated at the possibility that Glass's killer might go free. She returns home to find a letter from Gladys about her boyfriend Albert, who is, of course, Lance Fortescue, and how happy she is to have found him, and how he doesn't like having his picture taken, but she snuck a photo of him, and how much in love they are, and she sends the photo to Miss Marple. And Miss Marple even notes how sad and pathetic this letter is, and how happy Gladys is, and how, like, Albert is just using her, and it actually makes Miss Marple cry. But then those feelings of sadness subside and are replaced with triumph now that Miss Marple has her proof to convict and hang Lance Fortescue. Truly a magnificent ending. The final lines, Miss Marple compares the photo to an archaeologist finding that missing bone he needed to prove a connection. Just absolutely chilling. And the reason why I have this at number 2 is, you know what? I really have no idea. I kept wavering, and to me, this isn't really number 2. This is like number 1 tied, but I don't do ties. I think that's a bit of a cop out. So something had to be number 2, and I did pick A Pocket Full of Rye. Again, not so sure about that. Like a month from now, I might think this should be number 1, but for now, A Pocket Full of Rye comes in at number 2. And at number 1, the greatest ending to any Christie novel comes from a Poirot novel, and that novel is Five Little Pigs. And again, basically tied with A Pocket Full of Rye. In this novel, Poirot, like Miss Marple, is struggling to actually prove the killer is the killer, in this case, Elsa Greer / Lady Didisham. Poirot had gathered the 5 pigs and Carla and her fiancé to give this summation gathering, only for him to be totally helpless in bringing Elsa Greer to justice because he cannot prove it and she will not confess. And the novel ends with this seemingly innocuous paragraph about Lady Didisham exiting the building and entering her vehicle where the chauffeur places a fur on her lap. And on the surface, this is an image of luxury. This titled, wealthy woman has a fancy car, driven by a chauffeur who caters to her every need and places furs on her lap. And it looks like this evil killer is going to continue living in luxury. But there is so much more going on here. In context, this is a miserable passage because Lady Didisham is dead inside, having lost Amyas and not even receiving the satisfaction of Caroline suffering for Elsa's deed. Caroline willingly went to prison, depriving Elsa of any satisfaction and happiness. And since then, she's been a shell of a human being, dead inside and unable to enjoy the breaks life gave her. That image of the chauffeur placing the furs around her isn't an image of luxury. It's an image of death, reminiscent of her being entombed. She will never know happiness. And she has to live with the fact that she brought Amyas and Caroline together in heavenly bliss. And she is still suffering on earth and will continue to do so until she dies. And had Poirot been able to prove her guilt, this book would not even be on this list. Like, had she been hanged or sent to prison, Elsa Greer would have received a resolution, a blissful, quick end to her life. But now she will continue to walk it like a zombie, going about the motions of a human being, but being completely devoid of feeling. And I think it's this layering why I put Five Little Pigs above A Pocket Full of Rye. Not that Pocket Full of Rye doesn't have this layering either. But I just think there's simply more going on here. And, you know, admittedly, the teenage me who first read this novel for the first time didn't understand any of this ending at the time. Like, I completely missed this. But boy, when you get that this is a brutal ending, absolutely brutal. And, you know, as I love the Suchet Poirot adaptation of this, I think it's one of the greatest adaptations for Christie of all time, but they do change the ending up a bit where, you know, Carla confronts Elsa and she points a gun at her. You know, it's like, it's a fine ending. I get why they did that. It's actually very eerily similar to the Joan Hickson Pocket Full of Rye, where they changed that ending too to one that I also like, but it's like, it's not as good as the original. I don't know why they made that change, but, you know, this ending, absolutely brutal, absolutely deserving of the top spot. So Five Little Pigs comes in at number 1. And that is it for this video. Let me know what your favorite ending to a Christie novel is, or what you think the best one is. I'm sure we're going to get some comments about putting A Pocket Full of Rye too, but just know they're really tied in my heart. And anyway, next week we have a very fun video. I know one people have been looking forward to. Next week marks the 40th anniversary of the film debut of Clue. So I will be reviewing the film Clue, one of my favorite films of all time. And I'll also be talking a bit about, the board games and the franchise as a whole. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.